So, thank you for coming. It's a pleasure to be here and also to be in Berkeley Center. And there's Tom and others. Thank you very much indeed. I am going to introduce a discussion rather than to endeavor to deliver a learned lecture, which I never succeed in doing. I suppose the question that is behind the question on the board is just how miraculous was this South African miracle. There is a sense, of course, in which it was not a miracle at all. The outcome of the South African struggle was the outcome of 350 years of colonialism, 50 plus years of institutional apartheid, 30 years of armed struggle. And so the reward at the end didn't drop from heaven. It was something that was earned over a long period and a very difficult period. And yet, on the other hand, it was a miracle, because I can cite to you, as you can cite to me, many, many brutal wars that have been fought, probably more brutal than the South African War. And when the war was coming to an end, we discovered that there were no victors, there were only victims on both sides. There was no success, there was no miracle. And yet it does seem to me that we've got to that point in South Africa where we need to ask the tough questions about the transition and about the so-called miracle in South Africa. And I wanted to quote one of your godfathers, de Tocqueville, who suggested that new regimes all too often retain the mental habits and even the ideas of the former regime which they're seeking to overthrow. And certainly Africa provides numerous examples where strong liberation movements in various countries across that continent have collapsed into oppressive regimes the moment they changed from a liberation struggle to the beginning of a period of rule or governance. And so it's not to be assumed that the South African miracle happened 16 years ago, can you believe it? Has succeeded or is going to succeed. Let me begin by giving you just the briefest overview of, now let me get this contraption to work here. Here we go, sorry. A very brief overview of the history of South Africa that we so readily refer to as the miracle. And I'm going to give you possibly the shortest history lesson you've ever had in your lives. South Africa was settled by the Dutch, first Europeans, in the 16th century. This was followed by British occupation. And then diamonds were discovered in 1867 and gold in 1886. And this led to two things. One, the proletarianization of African peasants who were driven from their land and who were required to become low-paid workers in a migratory system on the mines. On the other hand, it created almost unprecedented economic prosperity for the white population. South Africa was divided into a black economy of subsistence and proletarianization on the one hand, and white free market capitalism on the other. 1948, the National Party comes to power and it legalizes the racism and the exploitation that had happened hitherto. It is imposed and it is enforced. 48. 1960, the liberation movements in South Africa, the African National Congress, Pan-Africanist Congress, etc., are banned. And both those major groups, the ANC and the PAC, resort to an armed struggle. Fast forward to the 1980s, and in the latter part of the 1980s, the country was on the brink of collapse. Economically, it was in decline. Security-wise, there was less and less control. We were on the brink of an intensification of a civil war. In 1990, quite miraculously, unexpected, President of the day, de Klerk, announces the unbanning of the liberation movements, invites exiles to return, releases all the best known or prominent liberation movement leaders, including Nelson Mandela. And we began a period that was called the miracle. I want to put all of that up. I want to talk to you about some of the birth pangs and some of the growing pains, the expectations that South Africa faced in 1990. Mandela is released from prison after 27 years. The economy was on the point of collapse. A bloodbath that had been predicted is suspended, perhaps transcended. The interesting thing is the country feels an obligation to address two issues immediately. And so I want to distinguish between the immediate problems facing the state and those that unfolded as time went on. The immediate problem was, what are we going to do about the past? And in the 11th hour, 5 minutes to midnight, if you like, in the negotiation period, a post-amble is written. I think it's a word we created. A final paragraph to the interim constitution. And it is said that the issue of what we do about the past needs to be referred to Parliament. It is referred to Parliament. Parliament, virtually with a virtual unanimous vote, agrees that there should be a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The two major issues at this point, South Africa living in that interregnum between the past and the future, and as Gramsci said, the old is not yet dead, the new is not yet born. Living there, South Africans find themselves saying, prosecutions and reparations are the issue. Let's just hold off on the economic issue and other things. Well, there was an offer of conditional amnesty. 7,000 odd people applied for amnesty. Some of those applications fell outside of the mandate of the Commission, but in the end, a little more than 1,200 people were granted amnesty. The others were subject to prosecution. Interesting that the Commission closed up shop the end of 1998. In these 12 years, very, very, very few prosecutions have taken place at all. And the government only a month or so ago has announced a list of just on 200 people who they intend to indemnify. The desire to prosecute, all these years later, is no longer a priority. The political will is gone, and it's time to move on in the mind of the government. Of course, there are those in civil society. Of course, there are those victims who continue to challenge the government on this issue. The other issue is reparations. The feeling in 1994, the first elections, the feeling was that those people who had suffered most as the victims of apartheid ought to receive some sort of reparation. Again, interesting. In 1998, when the final report is submitted, the recommendation is that there be a certain package of reparations. The government does not act on this recommendation for over 5 years. And when it does react, it reduces the recommended package drastically and says we can no longer talk about individuals needing to receive restitution or reparations. What we've got to do is put what resources we have into a developing economy so that everybody could benefit. And so it's very interesting how in the short period of time, a government, the ANC government, perhaps one of the strongest liberation movements in Africa, within that short period of time, begins to push aside issues of prosecutions, push aside issues of reparations. Not everybody's happy, but that is the mind of the South African government. And it begins to address certain other unfolding issues. And the one that had haunted the negotiations and haunted South Africans in 1990 through to 1994 and continues to be the major challenge facing South Africa is something called the economy. And not so long ago, I remember talking to Rolf Meyer, who was in fact the leader of the negotiations on the side of the old regime, the old government. And I said to him, Rolf, one thing you guys did not discuss in the negotiations in any serious way was economics. You said we'll leave that till later. We will deal with that when the time comes. Well, the ANC government has not addressed that issue in a very effective way. And I asked him whether this did not expose a very vulnerable side of any negotiated settlement, and certainly of the transitional justice model. That you just exclude certain things so that you can get a settlement. But then do those things that you excluded not come back to haunt you? And Rolf said, let me tell you this, we would not have had a settlement in 1994 if we'd put the economic issue on the table. And this was the price that the liberation movements, that the black majority, that the poor had to pay. To say we will settle, we'll stop the war, and we will deal with the economic issue as it unfolds. Well, we haven't dealt with it. So let me just say about that issue of economics, which was an unfolding issue. It was in the mind of everybody around the negotiation table, but nobody could significantly move on it. And you know, in South Africa today, we like to argue as to who has the biggest Gini coefficient in the world. South Africa or Brazil? You know, what a positively ridiculous thing to argue about. but it keeps us entertained. The South African rating on the Gini coefficient is 0.69. 0.69. The Gini coefficient in most developing countries is 0.40. Now, if you want to do anything, Professor Makadam, do something about those figures whereby one measures a Gini coefficient. You know, so South Africa's Gini coefficient, 0.64. The United States, something like 0.4. Doesn't sound too bad. But there's a huge gap. And I'm not going to get into statistics. Let me just cite a few to you. In 1960, at the height of apartheid, the South African economy was growing at something like 6 or 7% a year. By the late 1980s, the eve of Mandela's release from prison, the economic growth in South Africa was less than 1%. The country was effectively on the brink of collapse, bankruptcy. 1994, at the point of transition, when the first elections happened, 5% of the South African population, whites, mainly whites, 5% of the South African population owned 88% of wealth in the country. 60% of the health budget was spent on the white population. 4 million out of probably about 45 million at the time. 12 million South Africans were without access to water, black South Africans. 21 million were without sanitation or sewerage. 40% of the country lived in abject poverty. And 2008, just a year or so ago, on the scale of who earns more than 750,000 rands a year, $100,000, in 2008, a couple of years ago, 77% of that profile are white and 16% are black. And that 16% of black are largely what we in South Africa call the black diamonds, the new elite. And so what does one say? Unemployment rate in South Africa at the moment, depends who does the counting and by what criteria you count, varies between 25% and as much as 40%. And there are some sociologists who move around rural settlements who tell us the figure in those settlements is as high as 80% and possibly more. This was the situation that the new government, the ANC government, inherited as a result of negotiation and as a result of the first democratic elections. What do they do? Where do they begin? Well, there are many phases, and I'm not going to bore you that. There's an excellent article, by the way, this is in brackets, there's an excellent article on South Africa in The Economist of a month or so ago, where the statistics are there, the breakdown is there. So, Professor, you needn't do all this quantitative research of yours, just read The Economist, it's all there. It's very easy, but it's very well spelt out, and it shows you the different phases economic phases through which the new government went in seeking to deal with these issues. But essentially, the South African government, in its macroeconomic policy, has opted for high wages and redistribution. High wages and redistribution. And those who are employed at the bottom of the pile are certainly not receiving high wages by your standards, but they're receiving a salary, a wage, significantly higher than those in Southeast Asia and elsewhere. And that is one of the problems that South Africa faces in terms of exports and in terms of economic growth. It also opted for this redistribution policy of, through taxes and via other mechanisms, to take money away from those who have, the whites, to ensure that those who do not have receive. And of course there were some objections, the same as you have some objections in your country, if I understand the media correctly, as to who should have a Bush tax cut and who shouldn't have it. But very quickly, certainly by 99, 2000, the ANC government, this old Marxist government, this old socialist government, this liberation force, begins to tilt more and more towards free market capitalism. And that is essentially where we are today, as far as the economy is concerned. And when you read in the media of the divisions within the ANC government, it is in relation to this issue. The ANC government is a broad church, very broad church. It includes dyed-in-the-will old Marxists, and it includes uncompromising free market capitalists. And there's the debate. What do we do about the economy? With the one side into investments, high tech, that sort of stuff, are saying we've got to integrate ourselves more and more into the globalization process. The poorest of the poor, knowing they will never get into that economy, are beginning to rebel. As we say in South Africa, they are beginning to burn tires in the streets. When I used this analogy with Craig a little while ago, and I said when South Africans are unhappy, they burn tires in the streets, he said, well, in America, we just go shopping. But that same tension in the economy in the United States is there, certainly in South Africa, although more intense, because those who do not have very, very little. And on the other side, those who are clawing their way into this new economy are becoming more and more wealthy in a very, very rapid way. And so the tension in the ANC is, interestingly today, not between black and white, as much as between workers and the new black diamonds, the black elite. That's the tension with which we sit. Certainly, in order to address this disparity between those who have and those who don't have, there are a number of prerequisites that the government has identified that need to be addressed. And I just mention these in passing. The one is land. Always an issue in a post-conflict situation. Decidedly an issue in Africa. Because the land is us. It is our identity. It is the dust and the bones of our ancestors. You don't take our land away. Land redistribution in South Africa has not been very successful. It's also been more cautiously, I would hope more wisely handled than what it is on our northern border under the wisdom of Mr. Mugabe. But I came across a frightening statistic the other day, and it tells us that 9 out of 10 black farmers who have received land from the government in the redistribution process, 9 out of 10 new black farmers have failed. It reminds us just how complex and how difficult this redistribution thing is. I needn't remind you, on the one hand, African folk are wanting their land back. On the other hand, that land is the breadbasket of the country. It's got to produce in order to feed the nation. So one issue is land. The other issue is education and training. You know, I think of all the apartheid legislation that we had, the worst piece of legislation was the Bantu Education Act, which ensured that black folk, black kids, children, received an inferior education, which would mean they could never claw their way to a better standard of living. Well, today the government spends 20% of the budget, 20% on education. Just on 6% of GDP going into education. And yet the gap between what today we call the better schools, i.e. those schools that used to be white, and those schools that used to be black, the township schools, the rural schools, the gap between these two is absolutely terrifying. The facilities in former black schools are just appalling. The teachers are very ill-equipped to teach. And how does the government fire them? How does the government get rid of them? It is a trade union. Textbook delivery, not textbooks themselves, but the delivery of textbooks is just not happening. And so if there is one issue that's got to be addressed in the South African issue, a prerequisite to get the economy right, it is, in fact, education and training. If you don't get that one right, we're in serious trouble. Just one more word on that issue. We have a policy, understandably so, I think you'll understand, of preferential employment. Many black folk have been excluded. They now need to be included. Give access to jobs. Affirmative action, we call it. The tragedy is, the sadness is, that not all those folk who are promoted in this way, not all of them are equipped for the job they're required to do. And many of the brightest young black kids, as well as white kids, in South Africa, are offered lucrative positions around the world. And so they leave. Let me just say a quick word as one more issue, namely health. I'm not even going to go into what possessed the mind of our former president, Mr. Mbeki, Thabo Mbeki, in terms of his policy on HIV/AIDS. All I can say to you is that thank God, with his withdrawal, and let me say, with the entrance of Mr. Zuma, antiretrovirals are being used and distributed in a very, very impressive way. Too late, but is it ever too late? HIV figures, very difficult to project. Somewhere between 10 and 15% of the South African population of 49 million have HIV/AIDS. In some rural areas, KwaZulu-Natal, in Mpumalanga, in the Limpopo province, again, figures are estimated between 60 and 80%. And so we face these issues. The economy. We face the issues of a range of sub-issues, from education to land to health. There's one more that I didn't put up there, namely that's governance. How is governance going? you know what? I think okay. I've seen a hell of a lot worse. There are issues that have got to be dealt with. We have a strong and an amazing constitution. But as this government has entrenched itself over the last 16 years, so many of those agencies that ought to be involved in the governance of the country, ranging from Parliament through to what we call Section 9 committees, Women's Commission, Land Commission, etc., they seem to be losing their teeth more and more. They seem to be less and less reluctant to stand up to the authority of the central government. But having said that, this year's figures from Freedom House here in the United States give South Africa a respectable rating of 2 in its, quote, Freedom in the World Index. So things are holding, a 2. At the same time, South Africa in the United States Human Development Index is listed 129th out of 182 countries. So, on the one hand, on the other. Under governance, Mr. Mbeki was redeployed, to use our language. He was replaced by Mr. Zuma. Mr. Zuma has been elected in his own right, and I need to say to you, Mr. Zuma has done a lot better than the apocalyptic predictions that were associated with him when he was first elected. Let me just mention one instance in that regard. A month, 6 weeks ago, Mr. Zuma fired 7 members of his cabinet. Most of those who he fired certainly had suspicion hanging over their heads concerning corruption and related matters. So, I didn't vote for Mr. Zuma. First time I didn't vote for the ANC. He's a traditional old man. Best of my knowledge, he has 5 wives. He has 2 fiancées. He has 20 plus children that we know of. I'm not sure that a traditional old man like that ought to be governing what I would hope would be an emerging modern state in Africa. So where do we go? How did it happen? I want to suggest 3 scenarios. The one obvious is the downward slide. Parliament, Section 9 commissions, etc., are just not as vibrant as they once were. Secondly, the relationship between government and business is something that would concern most Americans. There is what we like to call a revolving door policy. That somebody's in government today and they're in business tomorrow. And a little while later, that person's spouse is in government and somebody else is in business. And the money and the tenders that are awarded are not what they should be. The economic growth in the country, probably around about 3% at the moment, is just insufficient to cope with the growth and the demands of the country. HIV/AIDS at something like 15% is going to escalate. There is political unrest. We're burning tires. I'm not suggesting there's going to be a revolution in South Africa. I want to predict there won't be a revolution in South Africa. The new ruling class is too strong, and it has too much invested to talk about overthrowing anything. In the apartheid days, the poor would want to overthrow the rich. Today, many of the poor are the rich. And so we have a difficult situation. I think we're going to see periodic rebellions, periodic uprisings, but I don't think there is any danger of a coup d'etat or of any serious revolution. And that's part of the upward spiral, I suppose. Is South Africa moving towards a so-called stable democracy? I met a man on a plane going back to South Africa a while ago, a year or so ago, and he said, you know, there are 3 miracles in South Africa. The one is the settlement we had with Mandela. That was the first. The second is that we've established a democracy and we're beginning to move forward. And the third is that Mr. Mbeki was removed from power and Mr. Zuma was put in his place without a shot being fired. Some would say that's the bad news, not the good news. But certainly the stability is beginning to emerge. I want to just quote to you 2 things. Bobby Gotzel, who was the chairperson of Anglo-American for a long time in South Africa, and he now heads the business, an organization called Business Leadership South Africa. He had this to say. I predict, he says, that within the next 5 years, South Africa will be to the rest of Africa what Japan was to Asia in the 1950s and 1960s. The point that he makes is that there is an economy in South Africa superior to any economy in the rest of Africa that is in huge need of goods, supplies, and services. You know, when I travel to various parts of Africa, and I go off to Ethiopia next month, in January, they call us, the South Africans, the Yankees of Africa. Because South African business is beginning to enter this realm, this vacuum, where our biggest competitor is China. Our biggest competitor is China. And trade relations between South Africa and China are escalating. And the so-called BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, are becoming the BRICS group, with South Africa participating in that process. So, maybe there's something of an upward spiral, I don't know. But let me round off by saying I think we live on the tip of the tip. There's a fine balance. It could go one way, or it can go the other. And we struggle to maintain that balance. Let me quote William Johnson to you. W.D. Johnson, do you know him? He's one of the most ardent critics of South Africa. Criticize everything, including the TRC and me and everybody else. I don't know when he's going to say something nice, but here's the nicest thing I've come about. He says there's a complete failure of government in South Africa. I could have told you he was going to say that. And yet he says, I love South Africa. I would not want to live anywhere else in the world. There is a dynamic in that country. There is a resilience. South Africa has been through some of the most ghastly experiences on earth, and they can do it again. As Archbishop Tutu said, the price of freedom in Africa is eternal vigilance. Price of freedom is eternal vigilance. So what do we say about Mandela's revolution? Was there any alternative? I think not. We had the capacity to kill one another. We didn't have the capacity to govern or to establish a better world. And I think the biggest challenge in South Africa today is not only the economy, but certainly the shift has been from race to class. It's not only the economy, It is how to keep that dream alive. I think those of us who are eggheads and academics and students talk about that as the soft stuff of governance. But how does one keep that dream alive? To remember where we were in the 80s, to remember the progress we've made, and to remember the need to address some of those issues that we failed to address in our constitutional talks. And at the head, at the top of that pile, is economics. I was quoting a German scholar to my class the other day, and I didn't know who said it. And I had several people in the class emailing me back, telling me who did say it, and I can't remember again. So you'll have to remind me. But he said, memory is the secret of redemption. Memory is the secret of redemption. That's an amazing statement, isn't it? Memory is not only the basis of reconciliation, not even the basis of forgiveness. It's the basis of redemption. And maybe it's only as we remember where we were in 1989, on the eve of Mr. Mandela's release, and where we are today, that we can keep that dream, which is Mr. Mandela and so many others, alive. But let me stop there. I went on a little longer than I intended. Thank you. Please. They're going to give you a thing, I'm told.
Thanks so much, Charles. I'm going to call you Charles, Dr. Villa-Vicencio. That was a wonderful.
I've just called you Lise.
Right, exactly. Really inspiring, actually, despite all of the problems. So my first question has to do with the dream, and we're always talking about exporting American models. But I wonder what, since this is your third semester now, I guess, in Washington, and you see how severely divided our own city is here, right? I mean, we are living in a segregated city. We don't have formalized apartheid, but it is utterly segregated. And I wonder if so my first question has to do with whether you think there are any models from South Africa that we might think about importing here. That's the first one. The second has to do with China. You talk about, whether countries ought to develop in either along the capitalist profit-oriented model or, I don't know, some kind of a Marxist model that hasn't really quite worked anywhere as far as I can tell yet. But we do have this enormously successful model of China, where there has been state-led economic development. And I know that China and South Africa are, of course, competing in a lot of ways, but I wonder about the extent to which the Chinese present a model for South African economic development.
Please let me try and respond to both extremely difficult questions. Extremely difficult questions. I am asked in most third world countries, developing countries that I go to, and I have a little bit of a problem with these developing countries because some of them are not developing at all, but nevertheless, going to those countries invariably asked, can the TRC work in this country? I've even had folk in Burundi saying, would you come over and help us establish a TRC? Truth and Reconciliation Commission. If you don't know what to do, have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Well, it's failed dismally in the DRC. It's gone out of business. It's in the process of, I think, failing in Kenya and in a few other places. Even Mauritius has got a TRC going at the moment, and they're trying to put together something. So, my response to those folk invariably is that this is not something you can import. It's something that's got to come out of the ground. It's what people want. And a prerequisite for a South African model and a South African dream is that everybody says, we're in trouble. Forgive me for my bad language. A very prominent South African cabinet minister today told me at the time, he said, we're all in the shit. We've just got to settle. We've got to find some way. There's a sort of balance of power. We have the capacity to kill. We don't have the capacity to grow. Now, America's not there. But there are those deep, deep divisions. And I've read, as you read in your media, some very negative perceptions as to where the United States is going to be, especially at the economic level in the future. Craig's question earlier to me, how many tribes does America have? The DRC has 300 odd. How many does America have? How do we get together? Now, there have been certain endeavors in America at a local level. Greenboro, New York. Is it? They had a truth commission where the people of the town came together and spoke. No, I don't know what South Africa could say to the United States other than, you've got to talk. You've just got to keep talking. And I think the thing that makes me so fearful is the nature of your political rhetoric. I don't think it's dialogue that one finds at the moment, where you are competing rather than trying to find one another. So I think that's all a South African could say, is that we were on the brink of Armageddon. And we spoke, to quote the minister, because we were all in the shit. And maybe a country's got to get to that point before people talk. I don't know. But these conflict resolution people like yourself know how to intervene before that happens. And I think that question about America, about South Africa, about China all hangs together, doesn't it? How do we create an economy that lifts the poorest of the poor? And goodness, I can understand why the poor of South Africa thought socialism was the answer. Not because they knew anything about socialism, but they did know something about capitalism. And they said there's got to be an alternative. And the South African economy, when it was growing at its height, 6-7%, pushing 8% at one point, it was under a command economy. It was under an economy that was owned by and manipulated by government. Well, it didn't last, as we all know. And I think the attraction of China is what it seems to be doing at an economic level, at a hell of a political price. And countries in Africa are not going to turn down those offers that come from China in terms of development very easily. And you and I would say, well, is it really development, or are they just giving you a railway line to do what? Well, those are not priority questions. And so I think that what we see certainly in South Africa is a very intense grappling with the economic question. How does one create both a growing economy and ensure that the people at the bottom of the pile who contribute to that economy are benefiting? Now, it's almost a contradiction in terms of good free market capitalist economics. But that's what we've got to do. But we're a third world country. I don't think the issues are as stark in your country as what they are in ours. But certainly you are right. Washington and various other places is segregated. In South Africa, it's in your face. I remember a colleague who went and studied in Germany for a while, and she came back and she said, you know the difference between Germany and South Africa is that when you walk down the street in Berlin, you can't see Jews. Whereas you walk down the street in Cape Town and you can see black people. It's in your face. We've got to face it. But that's a rambling answer because I didn't know what the answer was. Sir.
I just wanted to get back to the point you're talking about with governance and how South Africa moves forward. And 2 years ago, around Zuma's election, The Economist wrote a piece about South Africa and said that as much as Zuma might offer some benefit compared to Thabo Mbeki, the biggest reality that South Africa needs to face and that the ANC needs to face is that the best thing for South African democracy is a healthy opposition that can attract black voters. And Congress of the People was offered some of that, but it didn't win out as much as people might have hoped maybe. And I was in Cape Town last semester for studying, and I posed the question to a UCT professor, if Congress of the People really is that future, if it can offer that sort of party. And he said that even though there's a younger generation of South Africans coming into voting and becoming voting eligible who didn't necessarily share in the apartheid struggle, and they don't see the ANC in that way, which has attracted a lot of voters historically,
Sure.
They still see the ANC as something that they can belong to.
Mm-hmm.
And especially with the power of the ANC Youth League, that still really holds a lot of water. And I guess my question is there any way to break that? Is there any way that there can be a healthy, Congress of the People, he said, we'll attract educated, middle-class black voters who are disaffected with the ANC, but it doesn't have the resources to have a broader scale the way the ANC does. And what do you see that future having? Like, where do you see that going?
Well, let me answer your question by saying I voted for COPE. I'm almost embarrassed at Congress of the People. This is the breakaway group. I'm almost embarrassed because they've done nothing. I think many people voted for the Congress of the People, or COPE as it is called, out of desperation, saying, how can we vote to signal to the ANC that they're not delivering in the way in which we hoped that they would deliver, or expected them to deliver, or the way in which they promised they would deliver. So that's where COPE got its support from. But it is very, very difficult if you have this large, today, well-funded ANC with resources and tentacles going all over the place. And if you really want to make it, what you've got to do is get on board there somewhere, and if you can claw your way up, well, you're going to be okay. That's a very, very powerful organization. At the same time, I think, and you are right, one of the biggest threats to the South African dream is the inability of any opposition group to seriously get off the ground. And the biggest opposition group in South Africa at the moment is the Democratic Alliance, which is essentially a white group. There are indications of talks taking place between various groups, including COPE and the DA, to try and have some sort of an electoral pact, if not a common party. And certainly what COPE could possibly bring is black voters. What the DA can bring is organization. So if these two came together, maybe it could be a challenge to the ANC. I don't see the ANC splitting, which some people think it predicted will, with the left being the trade unions and the old South African Communist Party. Both those groups have too much to lose by walking out of government. They can exercise more power and gain more of what they want by just being a total pain in the butt to government, but staying there. And I think that's where they're going to go. So I don't think we're going to see a realignment of politics in South Africa in the near future, but it will come. And in that sense, I think the move by some people to establish COPE, and we can go into where they failed, is a starting point. I think what we are seeing is that there are an increasing number of black voters. You know, it's just on 50 million, 49 million South Africans. Whites are around about 4 million. You know, if you don't get hold of the black vote, nothing's going to happen. And will come in time. But at the moment, politics in South Africa is still liberation politics. You know, after all these years, the tragedy is it's still liberation politics, can I say it, in Zimbabwe. You know, if there were a free and fair election in Zimbabwe tomorrow, my guess is Mugabe would come damn close in such a vote. Because he's the father of the nation. He liberated us. All those things. So South Africa is edging out of that, but we're not out of it. Certainly not out of it. Mark?
Okay, I want to follow up on this theme that was brought up here on South African democracy. Because it's always struck me that South Africa, it's just very hard to make sense for people who study democracy comparatively. On the one hand, it's a stable electoral democracy, perhaps even a liberal democracy, and it has wonderful scores from Freedom House and Polity and other organizations. On the other hand, it's a one-party state. Mm-hmm. And will continue to be, apparently, for quite some time. And the elections, while they're free and fair, and there's not force and violence and so on, but they're basically a charade because the outcome is preordained. And so my question was going to be, had you not preempted it with a good question, no, it's good, whether there might be splits within the ANC developing. But it sounds like you already said that that's not happening. You don't see it happening. But then it leads to, for me, in the next question is the democracy in South Africa really just happening within the ANC? Are behind closed doors, not in elections, because we know the party is going to win the elections, but the debates between the different factions in the ANC. And that's how I think of, Japan had basically a one-party state with the LDP for 50 years, and then was out and sort of is back in again. But people said that it was really within the LDP that's where all the bargaining, the trading, the decisions were taking place. Is that pretty much how it's happening within the ANC? Could you say a little bit more about within the ANC how South African democracy takes place?
Sure, Mark. I mean, you've said it better than I can say it. That's where the democracy exists in South Africa. You talk to the top people in the ANC about the need for democracy. They said, "Oh, don't blame us. We put in our best foot forward. We're offering the nation a choice, and people are voting for us. So don't blame us. Go and talk to the opposition." But yes, there are deep, some would say frightening divisions in the ANC. And it is essentially between, and words are always difficult things to find, the sort of old ANC nationalists who were never really Marxists. They used the rhetoric. They've always been fat cats in many, many ways. There's that side of the ANC, which has spawned all sorts of very, very powerful black business leaders in South Africa. Ramaphosa, he's an incredibly wealthy man, virtually overnight. And he was the former General Secretary of the Mine Workers Union. So there is that old nationalist ANC versus what we sometimes refer to as the left. The trade unionists, largely COSATU, the Congress of South African Trade Unions, with some support from the SACP, the communists who make a lot of noise. I don't think they would have many votes when chips were down if they stood on their own. But they are generating, I think, a very important economic debate within the ANC, saying, hey, we've actually done quite well over the last 16 years. But the signs are there. The gap between the rich and the poor is growing. you're sitting with a 25 to 40%, depending on how you count, unemployment rate. You can't, this can't continue. You've got to do something. And so I think the biggest debate at a democratic level in South Africa, as you have correctly said, is within the ANC alliance, the tripartite alliance, as we call it. That's where the debate is. Now, what is interesting is you're beginning to see certain people walking out of that alliance. There was Cope. Now Zuma's just fired 7 ministers. You know, they're not going to go and sit on the beach. And so there are signs of some sort of political movement in South Africa. But, you know, I don't think it's going to happen. Zuma's got another 3 years to go. I don't think it's going to happen in his term. Whether he'll stand for another term, because he can stand for 2, I don't know. But I should imagine by the following election, in other words, 8 to 10 years' time, my guess is there will be some realignment in South Africa. If I were to gaze into a crystal ball, I don't think it would mean a new government. But I do think it would be quite a substantial opposition with these various groups coming together. I think there is that possibility. But it's 16 years. You know, where were you guys 16 years after 1776? But we haven't got time. We've got to move on it. We've got to move on it. Two, I think. Oh, Craig, you bumped.
I just wanted to kind of touch on some of the other comments that were made, and what I have to offer or share, obviously is can be up for debate. But the one I wanted to respond to was when we were talking about comparative models and things of that nature, and going into what you had spoken about earlier. When you were saying how, I think you began by saying how new regimes have a tendency to maintain the same systematic ideals of the former regime that they're trying to replace. And consequently, you could say that you're seeing that happening with the ANC government, and talking about the one-party state and how it has emerged into a one-party state, because there's also this the political systems and organizations have been basically they're all over the place. Looking at, I don't know how many political parties there are now. Last time I counted, but of course ANC emerging as the most popular one. One of the successes I found in my research with the success of the American democracy is that it has never tolerated more than 2 parties to really function, so that you do have your opposition, how people can go back and forth. I think you'll find with the ANC, and the only real kind of, I guess, was a movement, which was the BCM, kind of challenged the ideals of the ANC government, because they were, as people you may know, Neville Alexander will say that maybe that this redistribution issue has to come from a different, economic system that we're using here, because inherently, democracy, as you said, 16 years. It's only been there 16 years. And in the United States, it's been here, this system has been here hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, which is why it has been so effective and has been used as a model. And so just tying up, and this is probably where my question would come when we talked about the redistribution factor and looking at, an alternative political approach or economic approach to South Africa to solve its problems, not necessarily comparing it to England's problems or the United States problems or Germany's problems, but the problems that are specific to South Africa, because we talk about citizenship and ownership. In my research, as I'm completing my dissertation, is exactly about that. Like, what is the identity of the South African? Because, as you said, it's no longer black and white so much anymore. Now it's about rich and poor. And that is how people are supposed to, or apparently identifying themselves. And without access to ownership, can there really be citizenship? And going back to the Truth and Reconciliation, my question I would pose to you, do you think that maybe where this revolution has kind of been stumped is that because during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I found that we really didn't have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We had a Truth Commission, but we really didn't have the reconciliation part of it.
Yeah, thank you, for your comment generally, and I think you and I would agree very quickly around this one. I want to link what you have said by an extended link, if you like, to what Marcus said. Where is the democracy? Where is the debate in South Africa? Is it within the ANC, within the government? And the most critical voice in South Africa, the most intellectually critical voice in South Africa, critical in the sense of important voice in South Africa, is, of course, that BCM, Black Consciousness Movement memory. Where would Steve Biko be today had he not been killed? I don't think he would have been in the ANC government. He certainly wouldn't have been in the Democratic Alliance, white government. But he would have been offering this critical voice. And Neville Alexander does that in a marvelous way. I'm sorry to refer to specific South Africans. But there is that, somebody once referred to it as a dangerous memory within South African history. It's not a dominant memory. There's no great rah-rah around it, not a great deal of power, but it's there. It's there, continuing to disturb. And that is the BCM, the Black Consciousness, desire to find an alternative. And, the days of the Cold War and all that stuff is gone. One of you said, socialism has never really worked anywhere, but we continue to dream. There is a need to tackle this economic issue in South Africa. There's a need here in your country. There's a need in the world. But in South Africa, it is so stark. You can see the worst side of poverty by walking down Adderley Street, which is the main street of Cape Town, tomorrow morning. We've got to deal with it. And I think your comment is right. You've reminded us of an alternative vision, this BCM vision. It's a kind of an African socialism, and we don't know what it means, but it's there. It disturbs us. It is a dangerous memory. A person like Mandela who has just retired a couple of years ago from the World Bank. She's a BCM person to the nth degree. She's also a very wealthy person. And how you get her to marry these two, I don't know. But it's a big one. Craig, I think you've got the last word.
Thank you very much for your talk, and I also forgot to thank Rebecca for helping to organize this earlier. Two quick questions. One is, there's a lot of discussion in conflict resolution theory about the youth bulge and conflict affected societies when there's a large group of young people who are not productively engaged in society through education or jobs, that often they're going to get up to no good. So I'm curious, in terms of the large percentage of unemployment, what percent are youth, and how does that tie to levels of criminality in South Africa? Have they increased? Then the second question, just studies of race relations today versus 20 years ago. What is the attitudes of South Africans to the other, blacks towards whites or to colors, and how has it changed in the past 20 years?
The youth bulge, very, very quickly, is a big bulge in South Africa. It's a very big bulge. And there's significant unemployment. And they have a demagogue as a leader. The head of the Youth League. Even Zuma is finding it very difficult to control him at the moment. Julius Malema's his name. He's a demagogue. I think he's a nut. Everybody knows he's a nut. But he's able to whip up the support of some very, very angry, unemployed young people who respond to a voice which is other than the voice of, on the one hand, on the other, we've got to be cautious, we've got to do this. So that is a major issue in South Africa. What do you do with these people? You know, especially in Cape Town, where I come from, gang warfare is a very, very big thing. And many of these kids get caught up in it. It's not even a conscious choice. So the youth issue is a very, very big one in South Africa. And that is directly related to the issue of education. That if we don't get kids coming out of school with a decent education that makes them employable, that bulge is going to grow. And as I say, the biggest threat is Malema, this demagogue who shouts and screams. He's also very smart at one level because he reminds people of the old ANC Youth League, which was led by Mr. Mandela, and how he broke away from the establishment, the established leadership of Morocco and others in the ANC, and ultimately came back to take over the ANC. And that's the language that Malema is using. He says, what I'm talking to you about is ANC policy, ANC heritage, ANC memory, and we are going to take the ANC back. We'll see what happens to Mr. Malema. I've heard all sorts of speculation, including talk of the security forces taking care of him, etc., but he is a damn nuisance at the moment. And the bulge is there. It really is. And this is quite a serious one. Your second question was? Changes in race relations. You know, at the middle class, where I'm located, race relations have never been better. Middle class people are learning to live with one another. You know, very small, very slow, but more and more black people moving into so-called white suburbs. More and more of the so-called Category C schools, which are old white schools, are becoming more and more integrated. Kids going to school together, playing together, marrying one another, and so on. So at the middle class level, it's happening. It's working. It's working. We have some diehards on both sides, of course you do. But it's working. The real racial tension is still between the poorest of the poor, living in townships. No water, no sanitation, lousy schools for their kids, etc. They revive the racist language. And dear old President Zuma made a speech only a few days ago, appealing to the country not to reintroduce the racial language of the past. Now, this is Zuma. But it's there. It's there. It manifests itself when other things go wrong. But when those other things are going okay, people are earning a decent salary, their kids are going to a good school, they can go for a nice holiday at Durban Beach, then of course the racism gets a lot better. So money is not everything, but hell, it helps. It really does.